This is a podcast overview for the objectives for Chapter 4, the Self and Social Identity. So in this chapter, we're going to be looking at the different components and dimensions of a person's social identity. So this is pretty much, the ways that a person is affected by the world around them, by the groups they're a part of, the family that they're born into, and how that helps shape and form who they become and who they see themselves as in society. So that's kind of the first part of understanding what social identity is all about. Then explain what tactics are used when we socially present ourselves. When we give off a side of ourselves that we want other people to see, we are socially presenting. We talked in the last chapter about first impressions, and so we got into that a little bit. This is specifically how people will craft the way in which they want to be perceived by the world. Explain what introspection means and how we use it, looking inside ourselves for deeper, greater meaning. Know about social identity theory and the different comparisons that we make in perceiving ourselves. So we know how we are doing because it is all relative to how others are doing. So social comparison is a big piece, is a big component in how we evaluate ourselves. How do we know we are a good cook unless we've tasted other people's food or we've seen how other people cook? So it's really essential to understand that part of our identity is embedded in the comparisons that we make. Define and discuss possible selves as well as the self across time, and how do we change our view of ourselves over time. So we are one person, but we have different sort of sides, or you could think of it as selves of our personality. We do change over time, and this change might be due to our age and where we're at in life, our stage or our season in life. It could be due to experience. It could be due to the different groups that we're a part of over time, but all of that lends itself to who we are and the different sides of ourselves that come out through that. Explain how we evaluate our self-esteem, the different parts to self-esteem, and how social comparison processes function with respect to self-esteem. How do we measure self-esteem? So in the social psychological research, how is self-esteem typically measured? So there's some research there talking about that. Define the above average effect and relate it to the self-serving bias. What does it mean, the above average effect? And how does that relate to some of the biases that we have when it comes to how we look at ourselves and we evaluate ourselves? We tend to have a self-serving bias. We want to regard ourselves in a favorable light. And so this above average effect lends itself to that favorable sort of bias we tend to have. Contrast the consequences of low versus high self-esteem. Some people would think that there aren't any negative consequences to high self-esteem, but there are. So you want to be familiar with both low and high self-esteem consequences. Discuss research related to gender differences in self-esteem. So how do males and females differ in regards to self-esteem? Outline social comparison theory. So we're going to dive a little deeper into social comparison and distinguish between what we call upward and downward social comparisons. So those refer to the different types of comparisons we make, comparing up and comparing down. How do we fare when we do both of those types of comparisons? Does it leave us feeling better, worse, and so forth? Explain how the self-evaluation maintenance model protects self-esteem. So this is a buffer. This model is sort of like describes the means with which we try to protect and buffer our self-esteem. contrasts the differences between low and high self-monitors. So this is actually the subject of the article reading as well this week. So looking at how we monitor our own self-behavior in the presence of others. Some of us do this a lot. Some of us don't do this very much. What does that mean? What does that look like, and why? Describe the impact of discrimination on views of the self. So we will dive deeper into this later on in chapter 6 when we get into prejudice and discrimination, but it's essential to understand right now when we're talking about the self, the different evaluations that people have of themselves. And if you are a person who is the subject of discrimination, how that can impact how you might view yourself, your achievements, your accomplishments, your abilities, your confidence, and so forth. And then lastly, define stereotype threat, which goes along with that, and discuss the research on the topic regarding the behavioral consequences of the self as a target of prejudice. So when we are targets of prejudice in society, there are some consequences that go along with that. And a lot of things play a role in that, like stereotype threat. So you'll want to define that and understand how it can affect our sense of self in regards to prejudice. And that wraps up the objectives for chapter 4.